My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
I'm Ray Addison. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Greater Manchester Police has launched a murder investigation after two men were stabbed in Altrincham, one fatally. 31-year-old Rico Burton, the cousin of heavyweight boxer Tyson Fury, died after being stabbed in the neck at around 3 a.m. this morning. The second victim, a 17-year-old male, remains in hospital with serious injuries. Two men in their early 20s have been arrested and remain in custody. Tyson Fury is calling on the government to tackle the knife crime pandemic and wants higher sentencing for those convicted of carrying a weapon. Dock workers at one of Britain's busiest ports have gone on strike for 8 days. Nearly 2,000 union members at Felixstowe in Suffolk are striking for the first time in nearly 30 years. The port handles nearly half of all container freight that travels into Britain. Union workers recently rejected a 7% pay rise as it's below the rate of inflation. The port's head of corporate affairs, Paul Davey, says the strikes will hurt workers.
Unite, though, have declined. They refused to put the offer we've made to their members, their 1,900 members. They've had no say in this, and now they're having to go on strike. And that's going to cost each of them, the thick end of sort of 900 pounds each in lost wages.
Barristers are voting over a planned strike in a row with the government over jobs and pay. Members of the Criminal Bar Association in England and Wales have already staged brief walkouts. Now they're deciding if they should take uninterrupted industrial action from the 5th of September. The ballot closes at midnight tonight, with the result expected tomorrow. A voluntary scheme could help thousands of households with smart meters to save on their energy bills this winter. It's understood the National Grid electricity system operator wants to pay customers who ease the power grids at peak times. It says turning off appliances in the evening could reduce the risk of blackouts and save people up to £6 per week. It's hoped that the scheme will be approved by the end of October. Outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson has reportedly approved a multi-billion-pound deal for a new nuclear power plant in Suffolk. Senior government sources say the decision to build the Sizewell C nuclear reactor actually happened several weeks ago. The project will be funded primarily through private investment, but the government is expected to buy a 20% stake in the plant. The daughter of a prominent Russian man has been killed in a suspected car bomb attack outside of Moscow. Daria Dugina died last night after a suspected explosive device blew up the car she was driving. Her father, Alexander Dugina, is known for supporting the invasion of Ukraine and is close to President Putin. Local media report that the pair had decided to switch cars at the last minute. Russia's foreign ministry is speculating that Ukraine may have been behind the attack, but it's denied any involvement. Members of the Scottish Parliament are criticising the UK's new free trade deal with New Zealand, saying it will be damaging to Scottish farmers. The agreement will allow much higher quantities of produce to come into the UK without tariffs, including 12,000 tonnes of beef each year. But Scottish ministers warn domestic farmers will be at a disadvantage and they want greater safeguards, similar to the EU's restrictions. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. More news at the top of the next hour.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry for many with some clear spells, but outbreaks of drizzle will continue in Wales and southwest England. Let's take a look. Patchy rain and drizzle will spread further inland across the southwest this evening, with mist around the coast of Devon and Cornwall. It will be a warm and humid evening. Southeast England will stay dry with some clear spells. A warm evening here as humidity rises throughout the night. Thick cloud will linger across Wales with some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle at times. There could be some mist and fog around parts of the south coast. A mostly dry end to the day in the Midlands, although there could be a few spots of light rain around Birmingham as the cloud thickens. After a dry and sunny day across much of northern England, it will be a fine evening with plenty of clear spells. Feeling fresh under the clear skies, but turning more humid later on. Showers in Scotland will gradually ease away this evening, leaving most places dry and clear. Turning chilly after dark as temperatures quickly fall away, there could be 1 or 2 showers to end the day in Northern Ireland, but most places will stay dry. It will be a fairly cloudy evening. A southerly breeze will give a fairly warm and humid night across the south. Further north, it will be fresher, but heavy rain will arrive into Northern Ireland in the early hours. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. This is The Political Correction and I'm Arlene Foster. Today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry and by the Labour MP Barry Gardner. We're here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and to put you, the people, back in charge. It's not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. So coming up this hour, with less than 2 weeks to go in the leadership race, we'll be discussing the biggest developments from the week and looking back at the GB News exclusive hustings, which took place in Manchester on Friday night. We will be joined by the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education after he said he expected record appeals for both A-levels and GCSE results. And the summer of discontent continues, with dock workers at the UK's largest container port going on strike for the first time in 30 years. But as ever, here on The Political Correction, we want to hear from you. So if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on the show, then email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. So let's start off, as we have been for quite some time now, by talking about a poll released this week which shows that Liz Truss is set to win the Tory leadership race by a decisive margin, suggesting 66% of members will vote for Ms Truss, with only 34% backing the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. Going to start with Paul here. Is it game over for Rishi?
I think it probably is. I think the writing's on the wall. The only thing I can think, Arlene, that would sabotage Liz Truss's chance of winning the leadership now were if she decided to get drunk and drive to Grantham and to vandalise the statue of Margaret Thatcher in the wee small hours of the morning. That might turn the Tory membership against her. But anything short of that, anything short of a very serious misstep, then I think she's probably got it sewn up. I mean, I know Rishi Sunak has pointed to the fact, not without reason, that British politics has seen a lot of surprises over recent years. We saw Brexit, we saw the 2017 election when Labour did much better than we were expecting. We saw the 2019 election when Labour was wiped out. And he's kind of saying, you know, these shocks can happen from time to time, which is true. But it's very, very difficult to see how he is going to surpass Liz Truss at this stage. So I suspect it is all over. The only thing I would say, the contest is far too long. I mean, it's interminable now. I think it should have been sorted well before now. I suspect much of the country is getting a bit tired of it. I suspect some Tory members are probably getting a bit tired of it as well. Yeah,
it has been a very long, drawn-out contest, but I think it's probably because, Barry, we're in the summer months, not much else is happening, and so all of the attention's on the Tory leadership.
Well, indeed it is. And look, for me, I'm a Labour politician. This is the choice between somebody who says he's got no working-class friends and the other one who says that people up north are lazy. It's a choice between cholera and chlamydia, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, my goodness.
You know,
not sure we'd say that.
Not quite fair.
Lovely image on a Sunday morning.
Not quite fair. You know, with chlamydia, you might have had some fun contracting it. But,
my God.
No, look, you're not going to get me to vote for either of them.
Well, I didn't expect you were a Tory member now, Barry, to be fair.
They wouldn't let me. And but I think people in the country are looking at this and they're saying, why is it, on a serious point, why is it that 50,000 Conservative Party activists have got the right to choose our future Prime Minister?
Well, because we're in a party system, of course.
Well, indeed.
That's what we are.
But you know, it's one thing when somebody goes through a general election and the public decide which party is going to do that. But they do that in the knowledge of who is going to become the Prime Minister from that party. So I do think people are thinking, you know, this isn't exactly fair. And it's, what, the third time it's happened, I think, now? So I don't think it's right. And I think also people are saying, you know, all the things they're talking about are appealing to a very tiny selection of the population, and they're not addressing the really big issues that the public feel they should be addressing. And that's, I think, you know, Paul's right to say it's gone on too long. You know, maybe the Conservative government wanted it to go on long because, you know, no publicity is bad publicity. And it's good to keep your name in the frame there.
Well, and certainly at the beginning of the contest, there was a poll that said that people didn't recognise the people that were coming forward to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister. So I don't think people will say that now after this Conservative contest, because Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have been on our screens every day. Every day.
Yeah. And that in itself, you know, is biasing public perception. I mean, you know, it's not equal airtime. You know, the BBC is supposed to have an equality here. And you can't have that equality when constantly it's a debate between those two within the Conservative Party. But I think the most important issue is the democratic deficit and the sense that people have of, you know, stop talking to yourselves, start talking to us, the public, about things that we want you to talk about.
And some people have raised the argument that because it is so interminable, number one, and because it's being limited to the membership in terms of the vote, the membership of the Tory party, is there an argument to say, really, it should just be the MPs who decide who the leader is? A, you would, in that situation, get it done more quickly, and B, and I'm not saying I support this argument, by the way, but I think at least it's a credible argument. Look, MPs are subject to their constituents, to the wider country, in a way that ordinary activist party members are not. Now, I know in years gone by, both major parties, including obviously the Labour Party, Barry, until 1980, I think it was, just allowed MPs to decide the leader. And I think there was an argument at the time that actually you do, as a leader who's elected by your MPs, you do have more credibility, you do generally have more support within the parliamentary party than if a Corbyn situation, for example, where he was elected, didn't have the support of large parts of the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, but massive support among the members.
Look,
that is an important debate, isn't it?
You're throwing me a curveball, Ryan. I'll hit it right back to you. It seems to me that a political party is actually not the property of a tiny group of MPs. I mean, we're talking about 140, 50,000 Conservative activists being a tiny proportion of the population deciding on who the Prime Minister is. If you say it should be the preserve of the members of Parliament, you're reducing that to an infinitesimal percentage.
Yes.
Now, my view is that a political party is about the membership. It's about the policies that the members create, and therefore it's right that they choose who they think best should lead the party. And that's why we made the change that we did. Before that, we had a college, an electoral college system, so that, you know, it was a third the Parliamentary Labour Party, a third the unions, and a third the constituency members. But I do think you've got to say, you know, MPs do not own the party. That's the wrong way of looking at it. It's the members, it's the broad...
So if I can summarise it like this then, Barry, essentially what you're saying is it's the right of the membership to choose their leader, but what you're talking about is the Prime Minister and the fact that you feel it should be the country that decides the Prime Minister. Is that essentially
yes,
it?
And that's why I think always in a situation like this, you get people saying, OK, you come in as Prime Minister in our system, now have a general election and let's see if the public believe that you're...
Do you think that should be the default position, Barry, that whenever a new Prime Minister takes over, immediately they should go to the country to get that mandate?
I mean...
Because Gordon Brown didn't do it.
No, indeed, and I think that's right. And in fact, I think most of us would say Gordon made a really big strategic error in not doing that straight away. He was set to do it within 3 months. He did a brilliant 3 months. He'd coped with the floods, if you remember, in 2008.
And it was a terrorist attack at Glasgow Airport,
2007, rather,
then the global financial crisis.
He did really, really well for those first few months. And we were all set for a general election. And then, of course, David Cameron did his walking around at the Conservative Party conference. And I think Gordon just got cold feet. And I think that was a real mistake, because Gordon had been on a high and then that was called off. But I think, look, the Prime Minister of the country, we don't want a presidential system, but increasingly, I think politics has become about persona. It's become about people at the top, rather than a huge discussion of policy.
Well, you see, therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem, because it should be about ideals and ideas. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we've been talking about them, so let's see them. On Friday night, Alistair Stewart hosted a GBNews exclusive live from Manchester, speaking directly to leadership hopefuls Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, with just 2 weeks left of the voting in the race. So later on in the show, we'll be speaking to Alistair. But first, let's take a listen to him asking both candidates about their vision for the country should they win the keys to number 10.
What is the Sunak vision of how Britain should be through Conservative eyes?
Government can't do everything, but more than that, government shouldn't do everything. We are Conservatives. We believe in personal responsibility. We believe in families. We believe in communities. And yes, COVID happened, but that is not the norm. We've got to be willing to actually just make the argument, because all the pressure is always there. And as that's what you've seen over the last 2 years, that's not me. I don't wake up every morning and when a problem comes my way think, oh, well, how can the government spend some money to solve this problem? That is wrong. That's not what a Conservative government should do, and that is not what I will do as Prime Minister.
My ambition is for the private sector to grow more than the public sector. And one of the problems I think we've got is there's been an assumption by various members of what I call the economic orthodoxy that Britain is a low-growth country, and therefore everything is static. We have to make sure that we are taxing people to keep up with public spending. That is not my vision. I believe we can get to much higher growth. I want the private sector to be bigger compared to the public sector, and I want a sustainable public sector. You know, we have far too many quangos in this country. We have 500 of them. We need to trim it down to size, and we need to make the government efficient.
I am winning the argument about tackling inflation, being responsible with our borrowing, about actually supporting vulnerable people this autumn and winter, which my plan will do, Liz's plan does not do, about actually reforming our tax system so it delivers growth.
We do need to make sure our police are policing the streets rather than policing Twitter and focusing on the right crimes the public are concerned about. See, what I would do is have league tables that compare police forces and how they are performing so they can really be held to account by the public.
So, Paul, that was the two candidates there. Rishi Sunak saying there's an over-reliance on government is simply wrong. What do you make of those comments?
Well, I hate the idea that government is no more than a necessary evil, which seems to be the Tory line, seems to be Rishi Sunak's line, Liz Truss's line. And, you know, it's a traditional Tory line going back many
well,
decades.
Small state, they want a small state.
Well, small state, but, you know, really that government can only cause problems and it shouldn't intervene unless it's only really, really necessary. Now, what happened in the global financial crisis when the market failed and when the banks failed? What was it? Who was it that stepped in and put right what the markets had got wrong? It was government. Yeah. What happened in the pandemic when the government... Now, you can have all sorts of arguments over whether the restrictions were ultimately necessary. I've got a particular point of view on that. But at the end of the day, who was it who provided the furlough scheme? Who was it who stepped in to make sure that people didn't go bankrupt and that people didn't lose their homes, etc.? It was government. And this kind of Thatcherite line of rolling back the frontiers of the state, handing everything over to the market knows best, the market's infallible, put your faith in market outcomes rather than in elected representatives and national governments to deliver. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe in a flourishing private sector. I think there's absolutely a role for the private sector, but let's not get bogged down in this ridiculous idea that there is no place for government. And I think if I were, and I've said on the show before, Arlene, if I were advising the Tories, I would say, look, be very careful about that narrative, because actually the people in red wall constituencies who voted for you for the first time in 2019, they don't want a return to Thatcherism. They don't want a return that says, you know, it's the survival of the fittest, get the state out of people's lives, let the market dominate, because people saw the legacy of that in the 1980s. So in crude electoral terms, I don't think this is a wise kind of narrative for the Tories to be peddling, but let them carry on peddling it.
I was just going to say, Paul, maybe you're looking for a job with the next Prime Minister. But Barry, Liz Truss said her ambition is for the private sector to grow more than the public sector. What are your thoughts on that? Because you know what the public sector is like in Northern Ireland. It's absolutely enormous. I think it's about 66%. Absolutely. And we have struggled in government in Northern Ireland to try and get the private sector to be more innovative, to be involved in research and development and to grow. And it's a real challenge.
Arlene, you know I was Minister in Betty in the Department of Enterprise in Northern Ireland. And I absolutely agree with you. Look, I want a strong private sector. But two things. One, you don't achieve a strong private sector by simply cutting the size of the public sector.
No, you want the private sector.
You want the private sector to grow. And I think the danger is that, you know, I don't want a stronger private sector because we're getting more private companies taking over the NHS. That's the last thing I want to see. So I think that's the first thing to say. The other is that, actually, the way you grow the private sector is by addressing the supply side constraints. You see, what Liz Truss was saying is, oh, it's all about taxation. No, it's not. It's actually about the supply side of the economy. It's about skills and the employment, the labour base that the private sector has to draw on. And what this government, with her in the cabinet, has been so bad at doing is in boosting apprenticeships, in boosting skills, in making sure that that labour force is there in order to be able to provide that dynamism into the private sector. So this is really important that the government gets this right. The other thing I would say here is that, in a sense, she's arguing against the public mood. And she needs to be, if she's going to become Prime Minister, she needs to be careful about that. Because all the polls say that people are now wanting to see the rail companies renationalised, the water companies renationalised, taken back into the public sector, because they feel that with sewage spilling out into the North Sea at the rate of knots, with leaks in the pipes losing, billions of gallons every week, they're not confident that the private sector has been running those monopolies well. So, yes, I agree. I want a strong private sector in this country, but I want it done in the right way, with a strong labour base, with a strong skills base, with strong research and development, and for companies that can then pay their workers properly, rather than actually relying on us, the taxpayer, to top up wages through universal credit and other means.
And what's missing as well, I think, is in terms of growing the private sector, there's not enough focus, and there hasn't been in our country for a long time under governments of both colours, on the real economy, the productive sector. Yeah. We've become so obsessed, I think, with our reliance on financial services.
Absolutely right.
That actually, when it comes to the real economy where goods are produced and wealth is made, we don't talk about competitiveness, we don't talk about productivity, we don't talk about investment, we don't talk about the impact of a high exchange rate and what that's done in terms of strangling our productive sector. And we've seen, I think, as a consequence of that, massive wealth inequality and income inequality.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. Now, did you know one of Britain's biggest ports is Felixstowe? The dock handles nearly half of all goods that come into this country, and workers there will begin 8 days of strikes starting today. Now, it's expected that this walkout will impact a number of supply chains around the country as the port grinds to a halt. And this is obviously a big issue for the workers there who have not downed tools since 1989. Paul, more strikes to hit the UK. What have you got to say about it?
And they don't come out of a clear blue sky,
No.
Arlene. That's what I would say. I think it's a reflection of the fact that millions of workers have just had enough. They've had something like 14 years of financial pain, first of all as a result of the global financial crisis, now as a result of the cost of living crisis. That's had a real impact on them. They've had low wage increases for the best part of that period. And they're being told again that, you know, you are the people who have to show restraint, even though your real wages are falling year on year and your living standards are crashing. Actually, there's going to be more years of financial hardship. You have to pay the price for economic crises that were not of your making. And does anyone really think that workers are going to put their hands up and say, OK, fair enough, I'll carry on paying that price? At some point, they draw a line and they say, look, enough is enough. I'm not prepared to accept this anymore. And particularly when you factor in the fact that they, you know, as we touched on before the break, they see the fact that directors' pay seems to constantly go up. They see that city bonuses constantly seem to go up. They see profits going up, some of the big corporations making fantastically enormous profits and paying their shareholders fantastic dividends. Why don't we argue for profit restraint on the part of some of these corporations rather than arguing for wage restraint on the part of workers? And I just think there's a bit of a storm brewing in this country. And
and from the headlines we heard there, the barristers are going on strike as well. And I had an interesting conversation with someone on Friday on my show when we talked about inflation, and he was saying one of the difficulties for employers is the fact that they don't know where inflation is going to end up. So they're actually trying to assess, well, what should I be offering my workers? Because is it going to be the 2% which government's talking about, which clearly it isn't? It's now at 10.2%. Is it going to go up to 13%? What is it that employers should take as their yardstick for deciding on workers' pay? And I think that's very difficult for employers as well. I know we were talking about people in receipt of pay, but workers or employers find it difficult as well, I think, Paul, to make that assessment. Would you agree with that, Barry?
I think that's right. It's actually a really difficult time to be an employer trying to gauge what's going to be acceptable. But if it's difficult for them, hey,
I know.
It's a hell of a lot more difficult to be a worker and not to be able to pay your rent, not to be able to pay your mortgage, not to be able to pay your electricity and gas bills. And that's the reality that people are facing. And, you know, we're talking about a port here at Felixstowe. Well, DPP World, who were the guys who sacked 800 workers from P&O, they owned the company that sacked 800 workers over a Zoom call. Last week, they reported record profits. Now, DPP World actually own a third of the ports in the UK. I don't know if they own Felixstowe or not. But exactly what Paul's saying, these companies are making record profits. And nobody's saying, well, let's have a bit of moderation about the amount that is being siphoned into not only directors' pay, but into shareholders' pockets as a result at the other end. Because, as I say, what's happening is you and I are subsidising companies who are not paying their workers enough to even maintain their standard of living, let alone see it rise, and yet, at the same time, that money is being siphoned into shareholders' pockets.
Or going to Dubai, in the case of DPP World. But we're going to move on now to look at another story which grabbed our attention. Authorities have asked for excess death figures to be examined after it was reported that the lockdown effects may be killing more people than COVID. According to the Daily Telegraph, figures from the ONS show that around 1,000 more people than usual are currently dying each week from conditions other than the virus. Barry, are we now seeing the long-term effects of lockdown?
I think we are, because what's happened in lockdown is a lot of conditions were not getting diagnosed early enough, they weren't getting treated early enough, and of course, as that happens, people are then finding out that they've got these conditions later on. The treatment is that much more expensive, it's that much more complicated. But let's be honest about this, Arlene. Yes, we now have waiting lists of 6.6, 6.7 million people on the waiting list. But even before lockdown, they were at record levels of 3.5 to 4 million on those waiting lists. And the Public Accounts Committee recently came out with a report that said that they have not met the cancer targets since 2014. We're talking 8 years back. So this is the long-term underfunding of our National Health Service during the austerity years. It was a deliberate policy. It didn't not only keep pace with inflation, but as you know, medical inflation is much higher than normal inflation. So it certainly didn't keep pace with that, the funding that was going in.
Although if you take, and I mean, I know I use Northern Ireland as a yardstick because I know it better than elsewhere in the UK, but I mean, we're spending over 50% of our block grant now on the health service. I mean, that is incredible. There must be more to it that we need to do rather than just throw money at it, Barry. That's the point I'm making to you. There are other issues that need to be addressed as well as putting more money.
Arlene, we go back to the supply side.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know later on we'll be talking about A-level results and so on. But why is it? Why is it that we don't have enough doctors when kids with 4 A-star A-levels are being told, no, we haven't got a place for you in medical school? This is insane. We need to be making sure that we've got enough nurses, enough doctors going into the system, so we're not actually having to poach them from developing countries at their expense. And the whole push that happened about a decade ago when George Osborne came in and said, we don't need this headroom in the NHS. We can reduce the number of beds so that we get it much closer to the actual occupancy rates. So all the slack that was there in the system, which could cope with that increase, was taken away. And this is about the supply side. It is about skills and jobs.
And that's the issue you talked about, skills and jobs. Paul, what's your take on the lockdown excess deaths?
Well, I think the bill's landing to a certain degree, Arlene. I was one of those people who expressed severe reservations over the extremities of the restrictions that were imposed, the biggest restrictions on our personal liberties outside of wartime. And whilst obviously you want a compassionate society that looks after people who are at risk, I questioned at the time, and I think a number of people did, and we were shot down in flames, actually, whether it was necessary to effectively quarantine the entire population, including the healthy part, millions of healthy people, for a virus that ultimately posed a serious threat to a small minority of people. That's not to say for a moment that you don't throw everything at trying to protect those people and putting in place everything that you can to make sure they are protected. But I think, you know, those of us who said at the time, look, we're going to crash our economy, and that will have significant effects on the well-being of this country years into the future. And I think we're seeing part of that now. And B, in terms of people's health, the undetected cancers, the heart disease, the mental health issues and stuff, this stuff will come down the track in a few years' time. Paul, and I think that's being improved.
You wouldn't have wanted people with those conditions, you know, who wanted to get tested for cancer or for get diagnosed for other things. You wouldn't have wanted them going into hospital and potentially contracting COVID. So I think we have to separate out the very sensible measures that were taken to say to people, you know, stay away, because we're absolutely at busting point trying to deal with COVID, and we don't want you to come into that environment. And we know that some people, unfortunately, who were already in hospital then contracted COVID from the people with COVID who were coming in.
But cancer is more of a threat to people, Barry, than COVID is.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is...
this was obvious. The undetected cancers were always going to...
We have to divorce the lockdown, which was about restrictions on where we could go and who we could associate with outside of a hospital setting, from what was going on in a hospital setting in a medical context. And, you know, we can discuss whether or not the lockdown was too severe in terms of constraints on, you know, people's liberty. But I think actually what we're seeing here is simply the result of people not going to doctors, not wanting to clog up the system when it was at breaking point. Because had that happened, everything could have come.
But there must have been a better way of doing that. I mean, you can't say to people who suspect they may be very unwell, whether with heart disease or with cancer, no, don't come into hospital for treatment or don't come in to get diagnosed.
And
I just think that is so
frightened.
cruel.
Let's
That's so
be clear.
cruel.
People were frightened, effectively bullied into not
Well,
going.
see, I think,
People were effectively told, look, unless you are at death's door, don't come near this hospital because we're too busy.
And we could have set up the Nightingale as a designated. And what happened? We set it up, and then it didn't do anything. And it was all deconstructed again. So there were ways, I agree with you. I don't think the government...
I think we have to take learning points from what happened, and I think that's what we need to do. Anyway, coming up on the Political Correction, we'll be talking about GCSE and A-level results with the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. So don't go anywhere.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction, and as ever, we've got some of your views in front of us. Paul, have you some views to share?
Yeah, we've got one from Jack, who says the public sector is too large, far too many in public services who are not fit for purpose. Reduce it, we'll all save money.
Yeah, and Barry, have you a view?
I do. Tom says most of the privatised utilities and train companies are owned by foreign nationalised companies. So the argument that nationalisation doesn't work doesn't make sense, and they're already run by nationalised companies, just ones that don't put the Britain and Northern Ireland first. Absolutely right, Tom. And, you know, we need to look at this again.
And thank you, Tom, for saying Britain and Northern Ireland, which sometimes is forgotten about. But we're going to move on now to education. And specialists have warned that pupils may not have realistic expectations about their GCSE results this year, following a record decline in top grades and A-level results, which were released on Thursday. Chris McGovern, who's the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education, said he expected record appeals from both A-levels and GCSEs. And we're delighted to say that Chris joins us now to discuss this story further. Chris, thank you and welcome to the show. Why do you think there's going to be record appeals, as you have said, over this past weekend?
Well, I think basically because we've had excellent results, or they appear to be excellent results in the last 2 years at GCSE. Expectations have been very high. That's partly because teachers were very generous in the grades they awarded. And so expectations are raised, and now youngsters and their parents are expecting to get into the universities they want to get into. And if they fail to do so, then you're going to have appeals. And it's a legitimate process. Exams can be remarked. They can be upgraded or downgraded as a result of that.
The BTEC results had a bit of a disaster. Some people still haven't had their results yet.
The performance of the exam boards really isn't satisfactory, and youngsters are being let down, not for the first time. And some youngsters are still waiting even now to get their results. So what do they do when they want to apply for a university? And maybe they won't get quite the results they want. They want to go into what's called clearing, see what places are available, but they can't do that because they haven't got their results. So it's the examination boards once again letting youngsters down. And we have several exam boards, including one for Northern Ireland. And to some extent, these exam boards, they compete to be easier in many ways. And the easier they are, the more candidates they get. I remember a long time ago, before Tony Blair was Prime Minister, but when he was Shadow Trade and Industry Secretary, saying to Tony Blair that the exam boards basically ran a cartel. They basically closed the door on any other competition and they worked things out between themselves. Tony Blair at the time said that he agreed with me, but I'd have to prove it was against the public interest. Later, more recently, I rated with Michael Gove when he was Education Secretary. He agreed with me. It was against the public interest to have competing exam boards, not particularly well run. And I think there's a very strong case for having perhaps a single examination board, certainly across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Maybe Scotland would be separate from that. But there's a case for that. And when I raised this issue with Tony Blair all those years ago, it's because at that time, the O-level exam was phased out and a new exam, GCSE, was brought in, and the results are coming out next week for GCSE. But interestingly, we still produce the O-level exam in England, in Cambridge.
Oh, goodness. We seem to have very suddenly lost Chris there. I'm sorry about that. But when he was speaking about O-levels, it brought it all back to me in a flash there. I was the last year to sit O-levels. I have an O-level. I don't have GCSEs. So that's what happened there. I'm not saying that I destroyed the system. That would be very wrong. Anyway, we're going to move on now to talk about another story that caught our eye over the week. And women and ethnic minorities are reportedly being favoured in recruitment drives to meet impossible targets, prompting the head of recruitment at the RAF to resign in protest. Sources have said that job offers to white male recruits have effectively been paused to meet diversity targets. The head of the RAF has been accused of being willing to compromise the security of the UK to improve diversity within the force. Paul, I'm going to come to you first on this story. This is a huge story. I mean, do we care who flies our planes?
I think we care, but I don't think we obsess about the question of race and colour as some of our institutions do and some of our leaders do. And if this is true, and it seems to be, then it's simply wrong, in my view, Arlene. It's so wrong. I mean, all decent people should, of course, believe that your race, the colour of your skin, should not be an obstacle to your ability to be able to progress through life, to choose the career that you want to follow. But it seems to me that instead of taking what should be a colour-blind approach to these things, we are more and more obsessing about colour. And I think the danger then is you end up with an oversteer. And I think this is actually a manifestation of an oversteer, where people have said, for understandable reasons, look, if there are groups within our armed services, within our institutions who are underrepresented, then we need to ask ourselves the question,
why?
Are we doing enough to break down barriers? Those are legitimate questions to ask. But to say that we should pause recruitment for white men in order to meet those diversity targets is, I called it a form of reverse racism, and I was corrected by someone who said, well, no, it's actually racism as much as any other form of racism. And I think that's sad, and I think the danger is we end up in some kind of segregated society by default. So if there's truth in the story, and I think there seems to be, then it is really worrying, I think.
Yeah. And Barry, what's your take on this story?
Well, my take's different. I look at this and I say, the real story here is, why was the RAF not recruiting women and members of BAME communities in equal proportion to that which they represent in the population? They weren't. Now, if you accept that premise, that everybody in the population, whatever, whether they're a woman or whether they're from an ethnic minority background, is just as able, just as intelligent, then the question is, why were they not being recruited into the RAF in that proportion?
But the question might be a simpler question. Might be, why aren't they coming forward to be recruited?
And that's why actually positive action. And you'll rarely get me defending a Conservative MP, but James Heappey, who is the Defence Minister who was responsible in this area, he made it very clear that he wanted positive action, which is perfectly legal, and not positive discrimination, which is preferring somebody on a protected characteristic, which is illegal. So I look to the woman who is actually in the RAF, who I understand, who said in response to this story, you know what? I remember the day when the adverts for the RAF did not have a single woman in it, when actually they weren't trying to attract women into the RAF at all, and you weren't allowed to, right? When the army didn't accept women. So if we're going to look at discrimination here, let's actually get the big picture, not the small picture, because the government, I think, for once, has behaved absolutely properly in saying when we recruit, we want to be recruiting people of colour, people, whether they're women or people of colour, we want to be recruiting them in the same proportion as they represent of the population. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that women and members of ethnic minorities are in the forefront of our recruitment process, so that people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds can look and say, oh yeah, there are people like me in the RAF. There didn't used to be, but now there are. But maybe it's a career that I can embrace and succeed in.
Yeah, but that's slightly different, because that's a case of I can't believe what I cannot see, and it's important that we say that the people are welcome, and but that's different from discrimination, isn't it?
But if you want the best talent, that's what you've got.
I
don't
accept
think that position, Barry, is inconsistent with what I'm saying, which is, on the one hand, examine your structures, make sure you've broken down all barriers, make sure you reach out to people, make sure you give the message that this service is a service that will welcome you regardless of your background. But when it comes to the point where you appoint people, and this is what the story is about, and this is why what I think has gone on is wrong.
But it's not, it hasn't gone on, Paul. Let's be clear.
I think it has, actually. I think there's evidence to show there's been leaked documents which have effectively said, look, we need to front-load our squads, we need to appoint people from black and minority ethnic communities more quickly, because we've got diversity targets to reach. And that's the point at which you discriminate, because you say, look, we are going to put people on a contract, we're going to start paying them a salary, and we're doing it now because they're not white.
On a point of clarification, there has been one email which was leaked from 2020, whereby one person said, put on hold recruitment of white males.
Well, that's bad enough.
Put it on hold, right? But it's clear that that was not what was authorised. It was very clear in the instruction that came from the minister that there should not be positive discrimination, which you and I both agree is illegal and against the law, but that there should be positive action. Now, I think we're all agreed that we want the best armed forces we can get. And we're all agreed that actually there is equal talent across our population, black, white, male, female, doesn't matter. So what we should be trying to do is to make sure that we get the very best, and for far too long, our armed forces have not enabled themselves to get the very best because they've actually discriminated, structurally discriminated against black people, but structurally discriminated against white people.
That's very true, but you don't fight explicitly.
You don't then go the other way. You don't become illegal.
I think we are going the other way, because what we're doing is we're fighting explicit racism with a kind of implicit racism, which says, look, if you're a white person, and bearing in mind, some of these white people who applied for the RAF might be white kids from disadvantaged communities living in Wigan or some post-industrial town.
Wherever they come from.
And some of the black and minority ethnic people who have been appointed might have middle-class parents living in a nice, affluent suburb of London. So actually, that doesn't...
I think it's the whole story. You can't just say on race or gender, because, look, Barry's right. I mean, I remember when I was a lawyer taking a case for a lady who, when she was pregnant, had to leave the armed forces because she was pregnant. And that used to be the case. So we have moved on from that, but you have to look at the whole societal issue and not just whether you are female, but where do you come from? What is your backstory? And actually not just say to white working class kids, you're at the bottom of the pile now.
And I think that is, I mean, we're getting, you know, we can get into the whole concept of white privilege, which I think is a nonsense and I think is divisive because, you know, we were talking before the show that there are millions of kids from white backgrounds, white kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, who are often the cohort who do worse in school, have the worst exam results, less likely to go to university. And the idea that you should say to anybody, look, because you're white, you have some sort of privilege, and therefore, whatever your socio-economic background, we're going to put you on the back burner and, you know, give preference to somebody else, I think is appalling. But I do think, and I disagree with Barry, I think the evidence does point to the fact that this has happened because, I mean, a senior member of the recruitment team at the RAF has resigned.
Well, wouldn't you resign if you had been the recruitment officer who had presided over a recruitment process that had failed to recruit the best people into the armed forces, the best people into the RAF, because it wasn't actually representing the wealth of talent across the population?
I don't think that's why she resigned, though, Barry. I think she resigned, certainly the reports are that she resigned in protest, A, because the diversity targets were too stringent, and B, because she felt that the whole thing was being manipulated in order to achieve those targets, and that this is where the story of the pause on white men being appointed...
So who was doing that if she was the head of recruitment? Because it certainly wasn't a minister that was doing it.
No.
So who was...
Well, I think
she's saying actually did?
I mean, I think it's because a lot of our institutions have become target-driven now, and if the target hasn't been met, whether it's diversity targets or job targets, if you're in economic investment roles, then they feel as if they've failed, you know, if those targets aren't met.
I should say also, I mean, I've worked in the fire service for 25 years. I've served with some fantastic firefighters and officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds and women firefighters. I've never had one of them ever approach me, and I was a senior official in the Fire Brigades Union, and say, we think we should be given some sort of special treatment. We want a leg up in some way. I think most people from those backgrounds actually look down on any tokenism that says, look, you need some sort of special help.
Can we end on a point of agreement? We all agree that tokenism is no use. We all agree that positive discrimination is illegal and should not happen. And we all agree that positive action is necessary to sort out institutions which for years have discriminated in the past against women and against black and ethnic minority candidates.
You're such a conciliator. No wonder Tony Blair put you in Northern Ireland, Barry. You're such a conciliator. How can we argue with that?
Well, I think we should agree on that point. We've had a good discussion around that. And we're coming up now to the end of the first hour, and we'll come back again in the second hour to have many more discussions. But before we do, I'm going to read out some more views, because Barry actually talked about nationalisation and how Tom really wanted to point out that privatised companies weren't doing the job. But Steve, and I think it's important we have balance on the political correction, Steve is saying, having been around in the 60s and 70s, I witnessed how badly managed the nationalised industries were. People need to be careful for what they wish for. There you are, Barry. Steve's challenging you.
Well, you know, Steve's right. Nationalised industries didn't always perform well. But the reason they didn't, Steve, was very often because they weren't adequately funded. And governments successively said, oh, well, we can cut back here because we want to spend our money in other ways. And actually, if you are going to nationalise the industries, you've got to make sure that they are properly funded. That was the argument for privatising them. They could then raise extra private capital. So do it well. If you're going to do it. I think it's the best way. It keeps them in public ownership, it keeps them public accountable, and it makes sure that they're not siphoning off the profit into the private sector, but make sure they continue to do well, to make money, and to provide the service that they're supposed to.
We're putting millions and millions and millions of pounds every year into the private railway companies. Why not nationalise them, take them back into public ownership, save that money, run a better, cheaper, cleaner, fairer service?
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry for many with some clear spells, but outbreaks of drizzle will continue in Wales and southwest England. Let's take a look. Patchy rain and drizzle will spread further inland and across the southwest this evening, with mist around the coast of Devon and Cornwall. It will be a warm and humid evening. Southeast England will stay dry with some clear spells. A warm evening here as humidity rises throughout the night. Thick cloud will linger across Wales with some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle at times. There could be some mist and fog around parts of the south coast. A mostly dry end to the day in the Midlands, although there could be a few spots of light rain around Birmingham as the cloud thickens. After a dry and sunny day across much of northern England, it will be a fine evening with plenty of clear spells. Feeling fresh under the clear skies, but turning more humid later on. Showers in Scotland will gradually ease away this evening, leaving most places dry and clear. Turning chilly after dark as temperatures quickly fall away, there could be 1 or 2 showers to end the day in Northern Ireland, but most places will stay dry. It will be a fairly cloudy evening. A southerly breeze will give a fairly warm and humid night across the south. Further north, it will be fresher, but heavy rain will arrive into Northern Ireland in the early hours. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis,